I want to take time now to introduce Dr. Angelina Godoy. She's the founding director of the University of Washington Center for Human Rights. The center is an interdisciplinary department that promotes teaching, research, and engagement with entities working, sorry, I had a migraine this morning and I'm still super cloudy. And engagement with entities working for human rights. Professor Godoy is the author of 2 books and has also written numerous articles on human rights and other topics for both scholarly and general audiences. In April of this year, King County International Airport ended its cooperation with ICE following an executive order from King County Executive Dow Constantine. Dr. Godoy led the research that aided in the county's decision to end cooperation with ICE. She's here to talk to us about how to leverage data and to change policies. Please welcome Dr. Godoy.
Well, thank you, Maria. And thanks to all of you for giving me a chance to speak to you, especially to Ku and to Joaquin, who invited me. This is a very exciting opportunity for me because, as Maria said, the mission of the Human Rights Center at the University of Washington, which I direct, is to place the research energies and expertise of the University of Washington at the service of those who are on the front lines of human rights struggles so that they can advance the cause of change. And those front lines include, the people on the front lines for us include activists, community-based groups, but also policymakers and folks like yourselves that are grappling with the challenges of how to translate some of the problems that we can pontificate about very eloquently in the ivory tower, but don't always have the tools to know how to change. So this is a chance to talk to folks whose work I very much admire, and I'm happy to be here. What I want to share is just a little bit that we've learned through our work on the topic of ICE air and deportation flights. That work is ongoing. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we learned about King County in particular, but we're continuing that work on a national scale. And so hopefully I'll have even more to share with you at some point in the future. So before I plunge into it, though, I also want to say, being the keynote sounds kind of, I don't know, sort of highfalutin, and I don't feel like I'm that kind of person. I would much rather make sure this serves all of your interests. So I'm going to try to speak quickly to cover what we know and then open it up for discussion. And it also feels a little bit weird and wrong to be up here talking as if this was something I did or that the center that I direct did alone, when actually there's people right here in the audience who played such pivotal roles. Of course, Bukta Gaisor, who was then working for the county, is one of those, or Hamdi Mohammed also, who now works at the county but was previously a member of the county's Immigrant and Refugee Commission, and somebody I spoke to quite a bit throughout this process. Also, Jorge Barón is here, Silky Shaw, members of organizations that we engage with and admire deeply. So in reality, the outcome that we're talking about here was something I had a hand in, but so did all of those individuals and many others. So hopefully y'all will keep me honest, and if there's anything I say that doesn't match your perceptions, feel free to, I don't know, yell out, because I don't want to misrepresent anything. So let's see here. We began this work at the University of Washington Center for Human Rights in 2018, and we began it really at the urging of community-based groups here in the Puget Sound area who were telling us that their loved ones were being deported from Boeing Field, and who knew that that was county property, and who started to ask with increasing insistence, well, how can it be that at a publicly owned airport in a so-called sanctuary county, people are being deported on a regular basis? And that was really our first research puzzle, and when we started looking into it, that was what we were trying to figure out. And it's a little bit of a paradox, or it was at the time, right? Because we all know and knew then that deportations were happening. In fact, you could track them pretty easily using publicly available data on the web. You can see the flights. In fact, you can literally go to the airport and see the flights with a naked eye. And yet all of the mechanisms through which those flights were happening remained, up until very recently, largely secret. So it was like, the title of the reports that we released was Hidden in Plain Sight. We all knew it was happening, and yet at the same time we didn't quite understand those mechanisms. And I'm very proud to say that the research that we have published and are continuing to work on has kind of broken that open, and folks are dealing with that new knowledge in lots of different and exciting ways. So what I want to talk about first then are the findings that we gained through this initial phase of our research. So we set about tackling that question of, how are these deportations happening, and particularly how are they happening at a publicly owned airport in a sanctuary jurisdiction through a number of avenues. But probably what more than any other broke it open for us was when we obtained through the Freedom of Information Act a copy of ICE's Alien Repatriation Tracking System database, or ARTS database, which was a database with over 1.7 million records, and each one of those 1.7 million records represent an individual human being who was shackled at the arms and feet, forced onto a plane between fiscal year 2011 to 2019 around the nation. Since then, we've actually obtained an even more updated version of that same database, which I could speak about if folks have other questions. But this was the first time that anybody ever obtained those records, right, and had a chance to dig into them and find out what they revealed. And so we complemented that with interviews, with public records requests at different localities, and lots of other analysis, including interviews of ICE employees themselves. But the basics of what that database contained, you can see right here. So these are the total passengers per airport and the flight paths that database revealed for ICE Air flight paths. Now, I'm not going to be talking today about commercial flights for deportation purposes, which also exist, and we're also trying to understand more about that. But what we do know is that over the last 10 years, the use of private charter planes called ICE Air has really taken off from a deportation which used to occur on government aircraft. Now it overwhelmingly occurs on privately owned aircraft that are contracted out by ICE to carry out this business, and it's a lucrative business. And so what you see here, you can see there are 5 ICE Air hubs in Mesa, Arizona, Brownsville, Texas, Miami, Florida, Alexandria, Louisiana, and San Antonio, Texas. And there are many, many other airports all around the U.S. that are feeding into this deportation machine. So flights leaving here in Seattle, for example, some of those flights were directly, like they left Seattle and landed in Guatemala, for example. But more often, they left Seattle and landed in one of those hub airports, picked up other detainees who had been brought from other cities in the U.S. to that hub airport where they were staged for a deportation flight to a destination abroad. If you have questions about these, I'd be happy to answer at the end, but I'm going to kind of go through as quickly as I can to give you the basics of what we learned. So this data here, what you're looking at, is just for King County Airport, but we can obtain similar data for any city or any airport in the country. And in fact, we're receiving increasing numbers of requests from folks who are activists in different areas around the country saying, can you tell me what's going on at my airport? So what you see here is departures and arrivals, right? Because this isn't only a thing, although deportation, of course, is aimed at taking people out of the country, it's also intricately intertwined with the business of detention. And I'm sorry I missed Silky's presentation earlier, but I'm sure she explained that in a very compelling fashion. So these flights are both bringing people to detention sites and then removing them for purposes of deportation. During the period that we looked at from King County Airport here in Seattle, during this period, about 35,000 people were deported, and that was an average of about 350 passengers being removed per month. So, these are the departing passenger destinations just in fiscal year 2018 to give you a window into where those flights were going. Like I said, many of them went to these border cities that were staging points for flights abroad. And it's also possible that some people, of course, were sent to a border city and then from there transported to another interior city of the U.S. where they remained in detention. This is really just one window into the profit-making enterprise of housing and moving bodies for profit. What this slide shows, again, and we're looking at fiscal year 2018 only, just for ease of reference point, the people where they are coming from when they arrive when they arrived into Boeing Field in 2018. And they're being brought in here, as I said before, to fill beds at the Northwest Detention Center, where there's a bed quota of 800 people per day, and therefore an incentive to keep those beds filled. And as you can see here, most of those people were arriving from border areas. The reason I always include this when I talk about it, particularly here in Washington State, sometimes we have the comfort of thinking we are so far, in fact, those of you who aren't from here, you've come out as far as you can come within the continental U.S. from the southern border, which is often the flashpoint, and for very legitimate and important reasons, the focus of attention around the humanitarian crises occasioned by migration. But what we need to grapple with is that the border is here too, and indeed the border is everywhere in this country, because all of the drama that you hear about at the border in terms of family separation, kids being pulled from their parents' arms, the incarceration of asylum seekers, etc., our county here is intricately enmeshed in that system, because people who are suffering those abuses on the southern border are being brought here, housed here, and eventually in many cases deported from here. So we can't afford ourselves the luxury of thinking that what we need to do is encourage our congressional representatives to go to the border. It's great that they do, but we also need them to look into the facilities right here that are part of that system. Because not only our county, city, other places are providing a platform for profit making from precisely these practices in ways that should alarm us if we're concerned about human rights. So here you see some basic demographic data about the makeup of the population affected by the deportations from King County International Airport. What you're seeing is it reflects national data, again emphasizing that point. The border is here. It feeds into detention centers and airports all around the country. The bulk of the deportees leaving from King County were from Mexico and the Northern Triangle countries of Central America, that's Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. We also see in smaller numbers, but we should pay special attention to, long-standing communities in our area, including resettled refugee communities like Cambodians and Somalians. There are many, many communities affected by these flights. But at the Center for Human Rights, we're primarily concerned about the human rights concerns that are enmeshed in this system. And so what could we learn from the database itself there? Well, we learned a number of things. First of all, from media accounts you all may be familiar with, and also from interviews we ourselves did, we heard atrocious stories of egregious physical abuse and degrading treatment on the flights and in the airports as people are being forced onto the planes. Things like detainees being kicked, beaten, at times other forms of physical abuse like being dragged, having their shackles stepped upon, all kinds of racist epithets hurled at them, all kinds of degrading treatment on the flights and in the airports as well. And in fact, since we released this report, we obtained a copy of one of ICE Air Log's complaint systems, which registered, or the log rather, registered even fatal instances of people, well, I should be honest, one case of a woman who died on the flight to Honduras, arrives in Honduras dead. Other cases, a case of a person who miscarried a high-risk pregnancy. Really egregious concerns. Now, I want to be very careful. Those are cases that we learned that had been brought to ICE's attention. We don't know the details of the cases. Those are just complaints that were received by the agency. All we know so far, and we're trying to obtain more information, is that these things were brought to ICE's attention, and we are unaware of any measures taken by ICE to, in light of this information, upgrade, for example, the safety precautions taken with detainees, et cetera. We're also very concerned about due process concerns, and the database itself that we received directly from ICE reflects that. So it shows, for example, there's a column on it about called status, where ICE was, or continues to, record the quote-unquote deportability of the people that are passing through its flights. And what this shows is that in some cases people were being removed despite having pending appeals before the BIA or other ways in which the legal system still had resources available to them, and they were being removed in defiance of that. From King County, those numbers were 157 people who were removed despite pending appeals, and 2,615 who had no access to courts whatsoever because they were removed through processes of expedited removal. So for all of those who say to us and said to us at the time, well, you know, the legal system is furthering this process, the flights are just carrying out the transportation arm. What this shows is, well, the flights are doing that oftentimes in anticipation even of the legal legal process reaching its conclusion. And it should go without saying, I think, to an audience such as this one, deportation is family separation. And so we have human rights concerns about every deportation that happens. And we particularly have concerns about all of these abuses because they become even more egregious when you realize that they are being incentivized by profit. These systems don't make us safer, they don't make us stronger, and they are actually making some people quite rich. So let's talk about those business relationships for a bit. So what this chart is, we tried to make it as legible as possible, the complicated business relationships between the localities. And again, this is all about King County. And it's kind of unfair that I'm beating up on King County because King County took a historic step for which they should be congratulated. So I don't intend this as beating up on them so much as the fact that I already had the graphic done. So I'm just copying. But this relationship is just a representation of the way they would be in other places as well. So at the bottom there, you see King County Boeing Field, King County International Airport. The FBO there, which in this case was Modern Aviation, was the private business that leases from the municipally owned airport, leases hangar space, and provides a necessary link in the chain for ICE Air. So it's that private business. At Boeing Field, it was that single FBO. At many places, it is indeed just a single FBO that is doing the groundwork and the logistics of receiving those flights as they come in, providing fueling, all of those kinds of things for the ICE Air network. ICE Air contracts out and it has a complicated contracting system, but there is one main charter broker, which is currently, that contract is currently held by a company called Classic Air Charter. And they, in turn, then arrange for a series of private companies. The two most common are Swift Air and World Atlantic Airways, who are running those daily ICE Air flights. So when like for example, many counties and cities aren't doing business directly with ICE. They are providing the platform through which private businesses do business directly with ICE. And on a recent, records request that we received from ICE, we learned that some of the flights, especially the long-range flights to Africa and Asia, cost over $1 million for a single flight. Now, the daily flights that happen all the time to Guatemala and Honduras don't cost anywhere near that amount, but what my point is, a lot of money is moving through this chain. And cities and counties, when they're doing business in this way, they're providing the platform for those lucrative dealings. So what this is again, examples of invoices that were provided to us by King County to illustrate the relationship here. The counties or cities are deriving income from companies who are renting hangar spaces. Those are the FBOs, right? As well as from landing fees and fuel charges for the deportation flights. It's not typically, the landing fees and that stuff is not typically a huge source of public revenue, but the rental of the hangar space can be a significant business relationship that counties or cities want to protect with that business that is running, making the ICE Air flights possible. And counties or cities, in providing that platform, providing that airport, are legally responsible for overseeing the operations of the private businesses that operate on their turf. And this is a very important point. There are obligations that localities acquire in agreeing to oversee those operations. For example, they're supposed to do inspections and audits and those kinds of things. They're supposed to ensure the health and safety of all businesses operating at their airport. And yet, typically, because they're not actively involved, or for example, with the ICE Air thing, that was something that many counties and cities had the luxury of not knowing about until very recently, they may not be doing very much by way of active involvement in auditing those companies or the health and safety concerns that their operations raise. So I want to talk just a little bit, let me see how I'm doing on time, a little bit about our experience here and sort of the latest with this, and then open it up for any questions or comments or corrections from my colleagues who, as I said, were key parts of this experience. So as I said, we began our research at the Center for Human Rights in 2018, and we reached out to the county the county executive's office, who runs Boeing Field, in late 2018, and began in early 2019, meeting both with the county executive's office and with select members of the county council. And initially in that process, as I mentioned, the county executive was largely unaware of at least the full dimension of the flights. But when faced with the evidence that our research was bringing forward, they made, I believe, a very wise decision to get out front of the story. And such that on the day that we released our report, we had given the county a heads up that it was coming. On the day that we released it, the county had a press conference to announce its executive order intending to suspend all of these flights and to take concrete steps towards that end. And then a week later, the flights actually were suspended, thanks to conversations between the county and the FBO, the single FBO that was running those flights. And I can't tell you the character of those conversations, or even the character of the conversations behind closed doors at the county to decide them to take this bold step. But I can tell you how deeply grateful I am for it, because it made King County the first locality in the nation to stop these flights. And I think that's something that deserves applause. So, then what? What happened next? Well, one of the first things that happened actually was that ICE Air went dark. When we released our report, indeed, when we started talking to folks at the county, they were saying, well, we're not really sure which of these flights, which of the flights that are operated by, for example, Swift Air, because Swift Air also runs private contract business flights. They shuttle around sports teams and celebrities and stuff like that. So how do you know, if you're the county or anybody, know when a given Swift Air flight is taking off? Is that a deportation flight, or is it just a private contract flight for somebody wealthy enough to pay for a private contract flight? And one of the key tools that we had was that ICE Air flights, overwhelmingly, not 100%, but almost 100%, traveled under the call sign of RPN, which stood for repatriation. And within a week after this report was released, ICE changed the call signs. And so today, it takes a lot more work to determine whether a given flight is a Swift. So all the Swift Air flights now fly under Swift call signs, all the World Atlantic under World Atlantic. So it's not necessarily as easy as it used to be to track where those flights are. And this makes their deniability, I mean, it's an obvious measure taken to deny the frequency of the flights. In fact, one of the most alarming conclusions from all of this research is the extent to which ICE is going, and will go, and is continuing to go, to cover up the flights, to give us less access to information about them. And the other thing that happened was that the Federal Department of Transportation contacted King County and sent them this sort of threatening letter saying that if they didn't rethink this decision, that federal funding for the airport could be suspended in the future, and the county does count on those grants to introduce improvements at the airport, for example. So as far as I know, there has been no litigation brought against the county. That where things stand is limited to this letter, but it does sort of raise the possibility of further action. And I think invoking it without invoking the counter-argument would not be a good idea. It's important to also emphasize that in the very FAA guidelines that the DOT is citing in this document, they mandate a role for federally obligated airports, like King Counties and others, in protecting the welfare of local communities in airport operations. And I can quote you, and we do in our report, chapter and verse of what are those health and safety obligations that airports have. Including, for example, all federal granted airports are obligated to adhere to a specific executive order to address what they call environmental justice in minority populations and low-income populations. In other words, airports are mandated to discourage programs, policies, and activities with disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects on minority and low-income populations. Well, one could argue pretty easily with a vast trove of data from a bazillion studies, right, that deportation does, in fact, have adverse health consequences for people from precisely those populations. So what needs to happen, and what may transpire is legal arguments on those grounds to say, well, what does it mean? How do we reconcile these competing federal obligations? It's an emergent area of law, to say the least. In the meantime, however, cities, what I want to emphasize, may have more leeway than the federal government likes to make out. So what happened here in Washington after King County ceased running the flights, ICE contacted other airports in Washington. One of the airports they contacted was Payne Field in Everett, and Payne Field declined to run the flights. Yakima did not. So those flights are going out of Yakima now. I'm not aware of any threats against Payne Field for making that principled decision. What that suggests in and of itself is that counties and cities do have more leeway than is often acknowledged. So we see now about 160 people per week, roughly, it fluctuates, but roughly passing through the airport at Yakima. This is a photo of one recent deportation. This particular case is of relevance. There's been some public campaigning on it by an organization called La Resistencia here locally, because as you may be able to see by the facial disfigurement on this man, he has facial cancer for which he had only received partial treatment and was being deported despite this ongoing and urgent health concern. So what this suggests, the ongoing nature of this business suggests that all of us, I think, in the communities in which we are involved, need to ask ourselves that question: should public revenue be raised from companies that are making money by deporting people, in some cases, to their deaths, from a system that the federal government may deny, yet its own records reveal it is fully aware is deporting people without following the legal regulations around deportation in many cases? People in communities around the country are starting to ask that question. We are at the Center for Human Rights starting to get lots of questions from, not in an organized fashion, but just, we get a call from different places around the country. And what we're excited about is sharing that ongoing research with folks from those communities, or indeed folks in this room if people are interested in having that question, so that we can all collectively and individually in the communities of which we are a part start asking that question. Where does our commitment to immigrant rights take us now that we know that this business is happening on our watch? So I think I will leave my comments there, but I would love to hear questions or comments. And I put my contact info up there in case folks want to follow up. I'd be happy to pull the data on your city and send it to you. But I also feel questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Dr. Godoy. Is the microphone working? Oh, there it is. Thank you so much, Dr. Godoy. Thank you, everyone, for applauding her and doing that before I asked. This was awesome information, very, very important, very interesting. Does anybody have a question? No? Well, let me ask one.
I just had a question.
One, go ahead, Ateem.
In terms of the flight, so going to another city, and going to another airport, what do you see or think the impact may be? Say if other airports or cities decide to, what will happen to the detainees?
That's, I think, an excellent question, and I don't have a satisfying or an answer that satisfies myself even to that question, right? So I believe that cities and counties need to take their responsibility seriously, but at the same time, we also need to think about how changes introduced in the system impact detainees who are in the system now, and also detention and deportation patterns more broadly. In fact, I think Silky may have left, but she and I have been talking about this, looking at ways, like, for example, when detention centers shut down, like, what is the impact? And I think that that's one area where there hasn't been enough social scientific research based on real data. And so we're actually, and right now, in a fight to get the data that would enable us to answer that in a more systematic fashion.
Okay. Another question right here in front.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated the presentation. Three quick questions. You mentioned freedom access to information, and I'm wondering if that's an area where it's difficult to get information from the federal government. I'm representing
Yes, so I'm trying to remember, I should have written this down. So first one about Foia, Freedom of Information Act. Yes, that's a big part of our research is battles over Foia. And we are currently in litigation against the federal government precisely on this point, right? So we're actually against multiple government agencies, but relevant to this, we're currently suing ICE and CBP for their failure to respond lawfully to 18 different FOIA requests, not only about airports, but about a range of different immigrant rights-related issues. So it is a very challenging, but I would still say irreplaceable tool. It's a challenging tool to use, but it's irreplaceable because that's what gave us access to ICE's own records. And as advocates of human rights, there's nothing like having the actual government's own records. It's one thing they can deny, but another thing when, like, for example, when we realized, when we were able to sort of crack the code of what this status column meant, and we realized that this is where they're actually tracking people that are getting deported before their appeals have even lapsed, that's a much stronger argument to be made on the basis of their own records than if we just had individual accounts of individuals whose rights had been abrogated in that way. So that's one thing. I believe your second... Children. Oh, yes. In the database, that's one of the areas that we're continuing to research. In the database, there's only a small number, I forget the number off the top of my head, a very small number of children in the database that we obtained from ICE. So we believe that the vast majority of children that are being transported are transported on another contract, and we have some requests for information about those other contracts, but we haven't yet obtained that information. And then lastly, about outrage, I think that one of the challenges has been not having enough information about the flights and what's happening. I think it's an area that is ripe for community organizing because the flights are visible, because they are oftentimes moving through airports in areas where there's very active community support for immigrant rights, indeed where there's sanctuary policies on the books, and usually those don't mention the flights. In fact, that was the case here in Seattle and King County, but they are clear violation, at least of the spirit of those agreements or laws. So I think that that is something that may be possible now that more information is coming out about the flights.
Another question back here.
Back there.
Do you have any numbers of how much it costs, an average deportation costs?
The latest data that we've received from ICE will enable us to answer that question, because up until now, this is literally in the last month that we received finally the cost data. So I don't know the answer yet, and I would actually probably try to reframe the question, because you have, like I said earlier, there's flights that literally for a single flight cost over $1 million. Those are all flights to Africa or Asia. And then there's flights that cost, the flights to the northern portion of Central America and Mexico are much less expensive, they're much more routine, et cetera. And so in the average numbers might not be, a single average number wouldn't capture that vast difference, right? But we can calculate, and in fact, that's what we're doing now, looking at these flights and which ones are the most costly per person, all of that kind of stuff. We have that now.
And I have one.
Yeah.
And I'm going to use my privilege right now to ask it. So local municipalities are increasingly finding themselves in opposition to this federal administration rhetoric and policies. As you were talking, I was making those connections. I need to connect with our university professors and researchers to do this for our area. What do you think local governments can and should do to actively defy the federal, or what do you think local governments can or should do in actively defying the federal government's policies, given the issues of jurisdiction and local priorities?
Well, I think you need to have a lawyer advise you on that, and I'm not a lawyer, but I think first and foremost, I would encourage you to reach out to the immigrant rights groups in your own community. And sure, I think local universities could be a resource to you, but I would also say this research has been kind of esoteric. I've become uniquely obsessed with ICE Air. And so I wouldn't expect that any university would or even should seek to replicate that. I mean, we have the data. If you wanted to contact me, I'd be happy to give you the data on your locality, and you could ask your local folks to help you in terms of community work in those communities in your area.
Great, and then that leads to my other question. What other projects is the center working on?
Oh, well, we work on many projects. We right now we have three main areas in which we work. We're actually a very small center. So one of them is we work on cases of crimes against humanity that transpired in El Salvador during the armed conflict there and efforts to pursue justice for those now. That's one project. Another project is on mass incarceration in the United States, but especially in Washington state. And then our third project, our most recent one, is immigrant rights. We focus on Washington state, but at times, like in this case where we obtain national data, we're increasingly looking outside the state to ways that we can hopefully catalyze relationships with other folks. So
Perfect.
those are the areas we're working in right now.
One more question?
Yes. So we did one way we can sort of slice and dice this data is by airports, and another way is by nationalities, for example. So as part of our research, we pulled out the data on deportations of different nationalities, and we looked at the Mexican cases. Many of the Mexican cases, what you'd see on the air path is just that they're taken to the border and then they're bussed across the border. So we've done a little bit of research on that, but we don't have a database of the buses per se. But there's also a greater diversity than we had expected in terms of where people are being flown to and then bussed across. Some people are still being flown into Mexico, and I don't know this it raises as many questions as it answers. One of them is sort of like, why is this person flown into Mexico and this other person is flown to the border and bussed across? There's a lot that we still don't know.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Godoy, everybody.
Mayor Jenny embodies the best editorial I've read on our moral obligation to children. No, the editorial wasn't from the venerable New York Times or Washington Post or the familiar advocates like the Children's Defense Fund. The editorial was from Highlights, the children's magazine. I grew up seeing Highlights magazine in all the doctor's offices. So I quote, "Children are the world's most important people. This is a belief about all children. This is a plea for recognition that these are not children of strangers for whom others are accountable. This is an appeal to elevate the inalienable rights of all children to feel safe and to have the opportunity to become their best selves." This editorial was published at the height of the family detention policies that Trump passed in the summer of last year. And that same month in June, when news broke out about the cruelty of Trump's border detention policies and the separation of children and their caregivers, Mayor Jenny disrupted her very busy schedule and traveled to Tornillo, Texas, with 20 mayors to gain access to the detention center. Their visit drew local and national attention to Trump's blatant disregard for the children's humanity. And she brought her experience and message home to our cabinet, her cabinet, expressing fear for the physical and emotional safety of all the detained children. I don't know if anyone noticed, but as a parent of 2 children who are proud of their immigrant heritage from Vietnam and from Japan, it was not lost on me that Mayor Jenny called the children in detention our children. But you know, leadership is more than just saying the right things. It's about getting things done. And under her leadership, Seattle offers free preschool, and that program has expanded. Under her leadership, every graduating public high school student in Seattle can go to college for free for 2 years. And this commitment includes support for obstacles like books and fees and childcare and transportation. And every student can get a free transit card to use on our buses, our light rail, and our new Foia cabs. Mayor Jenny has pushed every city department and our Seattle corporations to create pathways for low-income youth to get paid internships so they don't have to decide between a job that pays the bills or a job that gets them ahead. Mayor Jenny believes these are opportunities that all of our children and youth deserve. And she knows the importance of keeping families together, and last year invested $1 million to make our Immigrant Legal Defense Fund permanent, giving Seattle residents and workers who face removal proceedings their best chance to stay rooted here in Seattle. And this is a mayor who understands that investments in affordable housing, education, and jobs are also investments in immigrant families, because our bread and butter issues are the same as any families. These are but a few ways that the Mayor Jenny that I know has made her belief and the importance of our immigrant residents and making those beliefs real. I'm prouder to call my mayor Jenny, so please help me welcome Seattle's 56th mayor and the first female mayor in nearly a century, Jenny A. Durkan.
Thanks so much. Koo, that was amazing. Thank you. Welcome. Good afternoon. Come on, post-afternoon. There's not enough coffee. Good afternoon. There we go. I want to thank everyone here for being in Seattle and for having this convening of the Cities for Action. I want to first recognize the staff from New York City Mayor's Office. Thank you so much for being here. And I know you've been working closely with our office, and I want everyone to give a round of applause to Koo for all she does. You know, we really try to make it a truth that Seattle is a welcoming city, because the words are easy, but the actions are more important. And here we know that those actions really are important. I really want to recognize too what a tremendous job that Cities for Action is doing. When I was reading some of the remarks that they prepared for me about how much you've grown and what you're doing, I was really awed, in fact. 200 executives of municipalities nationwide who represent over 70 million Americans and over 17 million immigrant and refugees across the U.S. That's astonishing. So thank you for all the work you're doing. It's amazing. Today in this room, 50 attendees from 32 different municipalities. I have a fellow mayor here. Mayor, thank you very much for being here. Any other mayors in the house? All right. We know that you represent the best of what we need to be doing nationwide. I can't tell you, and I think can't actually express how deeply sorrowful I am that we need your work. I never thought I would be living in our country at a time when there was so much overt action and hostility against our immigrants and refugees, and the need for groups like yours to take action and take action urgently. We know that it's no secret that under this president, there's an all-out assault against immigrant and refugees in our country. And Koo mentioned how I and other mayors went to the border. We first did a resolution against the separation of children, and then we took a delegation to the border, bipartisan, Republican and Democrats. And I'm a mom, 2 kids, and I can remember stepping off that bus. It was about 10 a.m. and about 94 degrees. And there in the desert, behind fences and barbed wire and armed guards, were tents for children taken from their parents. That is not America. That is not who we are, and we must fight it at every level. So I am so pleased to have this kind of collaboration nationwide to see how can we work together to uplift those people who need lifting up, to put in place programs. We know that cities have become the safety net of America. But with that safety net also comes an obligation to say we can step in, we will step in, and to set the example that things can be done. I know that the list of acts under this current administration are long and horrifying. That someone would have to choose between taking a benefit that their family needed and worrying that it could get them expelled from our country. Calling people public charges is itself, in my view, insulting and un-American. Part of it is informed by my own experience. My grandfather came from Ireland, and a lot of people think of Ireland as the land of kind of green and leprechauns and happy people. Which it is in many ways, but when my grandfather was 16, it was a war-torn country. People were dying of famine and starvation, and over 1 million people left that small island. He left at 16, and anyone who knows any Irish young man knows no 16-year-old leaves his mother, if he's Irish. But he bopped to different countries and finally landed here in America. Made his way to Montana, where with many other immigrants and refugees worked in the smelter mines, and then ran for the House of Representatives in Montana and actually won. His sons fought in the war for our country, and his granddaughter stands before you as mayor of Seattle, the best city in the country, no matter where you're from. Sorry about that. But that is quintessentially who we are as America. We open our doors, we welcome people, we lift them up, we make a home, and we let them get their highest, best selves. That's what we have to work for together. That's what these collaborations are about. And that's why I'm so proud that you would have your convening here in Seattle with all the work you're doing. And sometimes I know feeling that it must feel just too much, but it's not, because I truly believe in my heart that the good people in this country will prevail, that our values can and will prevail. And at the end of the day, what makes us who we are is our diversity. Seattle has grown so rapidly in King County. So much of that has come from immigrants and refugees. And that's been true since the beginning of time in Seattle. So we know that our heritage is from people coming from other places. In fact, a very not well-known fact about me is I am the first mayor of Seattle who was actually born in Seattle. So think about that. So that tells you we are a city where people come from all over, and it has made us stronger, it has made us better, it has made us one of the most innovative, best places, not just in America, but in the world. Okay, now I'm talking like a mayor. But I want that world for my son. I want that country for my sons that really does open its arm and lift people up instead of looking for ways to divide us. So thank you for being here for your collaborations and your convenings. It's really remarkable to have you. Ku, thank you so much for everything you and your office is doing. I want to give your whole team a shout out. Because I know there's no magic wands that make these things just happen. So that's great. Any questions, or just want me to leave, or what do you want to do?
Please, I'm sorry.
I don't need the mic.
Do not whack your boss in the mouth with a mic. I know you've got a lot on your calendar. We thought we'd just take a couple minutes for any questions.
My voice is rough, so I wouldn't use the mic. Normally I would. Question? Go ahead, right here.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm from the Mayor's Office of the City of Atlanta. Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. And Seattle is very fabulous and wonderful. So thank you for having us here and creating such a beautiful city. It's so inspiring to hear how energized you are by this work, and you and Ku's whole team seem to have such a great synergy around this kind of work. My question is two parts. Can you tell us, outside of your experience at the border, what really energizes you about this work, and what can we learn from that to take to our respective cities to get our mayors equally as energized?
That's a really great question. So a couple things. I think for me, you know, I came from a large family with 8 kids in my family. I have 2 sons, and I can't imagine a world that doesn't continue to be rich and diverse and opening and welcoming. I mean, that just, to me, is positive. And so if we're imagining that future for our country, for our city, for our states, we want that world to have that tapestry. And so I think I'm enthused because I believe to my bones that's our better us. And it sounds like hard work, but if you center yourselves on true equity and justice, it's not that hard. So when you set a program up that you think is a good program for children, it should be for all children. It shouldn't be just for those who are documented or have some legal papers. It should be for every kid. And so if you just work issue by issue and sector by sector and know what's going to impact families the most, then I think you can have a real change. And if you go to those things that are unifying, every person in the world is somebody's child. Think about that. Every person is somebody's child. So everyone has some context of the importance of having that bond between parents and children, or grandparents and children, or brothers and sisters. And so if you base your good on doing better by kids, and that's your sole focus, then you don't have to get into all other legal issues or distinctions or the partisan divide. You're just making sure every kid has good child care, access to pre-K, their parents have good health care, and family wage jobs. I think really focusing in on the things that bring us together, because then people can put aside some of those differences. And if they don't, we blow through the differences anyways. There's a mic coming to you right now.
Okay. Mayor Jenny, greetings from San Francisco. Mayor London Breed, I'm Adrienne Pon, and also San Francisco is home of the Golden State Warriors. You have your soccer.
We're bringing the
basketball.
Sonics back, and we got the Seattle Storm.
So under your leadership, the Seattle Office of Immigrant and Refugee Affairs has emerged as a fierce defender of immigrant and vulnerable communities, especially around youth and children. What advice would you give to other mayors about having the political courage to fight the good fight along with you?
I would say that you know it's right. That's where it starts with. If you know it's right, you do it. And I believe that if you base the approach and you base the policies on raising up kids and giving them opportunity and giving them a chance at healthy lives, who really could disagree with that? I mean, that's as simple as it gets. And then as you want those kids to be healthy, that means their families have to be healthy. That means you've got to bring their parents out of the shadows, like we have a domestic workers' bill of rights and a domestic workers' law that will give minimum wage to them. Our immigrant and refugee drivers for Uber and Lyft, we're sending down legislation today to guarantee them minimum wage and expenses, making sure. And if you treat people right and fairly, everybody benefits. You know, the argument that somehow by treating people justly, it takes away from anyone else, it's just not true. So it's not only the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. I mean, Seattle has been immensely fortunate. We've had a great economy, great prosperity, but we got to figure out how to make sure that is shared prosperity and that the opportunities for the great jobs in the new economy actually go to the youth from Seattle. And from San Francisco.
Thank you for your words and your leadership on this issue. I guess one big question that is often challenging is just how to ensure that the voices that are in the mix on this issue are a diverse set of voices, and that include the business community. You have a strong business community, many starting here and growing here in Seattle, and I wonder if you have a strategy or guidance on how best to bring those folks to the table in recognizing what you said as being an important investment, not just on values, but on the future growth of the city and the country as a whole.
That's a great question, because I think that, again, it gets back, if you do things that are values-based, I think you bring people along more quickly. And I've got to really hand it to Ku. We did, for example, we have a day where we give a legal clinic for immigrants and refugees. And she was able to not just involve the business community. I think, how many lawyers from Amazon did you have? Like 20 or 30, something like that. Almost the entire legal department came to show that they believed in it. When we did our Families and Education Levy, which was the levy that expanded our pre-K and gave the 2 years free college, we got to all the businesses and talked to them about how important it was to give that opportunity, and they supported it, and now they're supporting it further because we're trying to match every one of those kids that goes to college. We want to match them with internships in our labor unions, in our companies, in our artistic ventures, so that they have not just college, but they come out with a family wage job and with a passion. And we did our first pilot last summer. We got 30 of our, we call them our promise students. We got 30 of those students connected to internships. And the internships varied because we're really trying to say to the students, what do you want to do? What would be your passion? And then we try to go make sure that we have options like that. So I think I think if we talk about these issues as the values first, it's more unifying. Because if you're a person who doesn't believe that children shouldn't have opportunity, that's un-American. I mean, it just is, and it's not humane. And so if you really talk about how important it is to stand for those values, and then you can show how it actually also gives you a business, economic, and regional advantage, then you've got both sides. So I think you have to be able to say both things, but I think bringing them in early and getting them fitted in everywhere you can, I think is really important. Thank you very much.